Hey guys, tonight we're going to ancient Egypt, and I want you to do something before you close your eyes. I want you to picture a river. Not a small river, a massive one. A river that floods every single year like clockwork, deposits a thick layer of dark, incredibly fertile soil on its banks, and then recedes, leaving behind land so rich that you can grow almost anything in it. A river running through one of the driest, most hostile deserts on Earth. A river that made civilization possible in a place where civilization had absolutely no business existing. That's the Nile, and along the banks of that river for more than 3,000 years, one of the most extraordinary civilizations in the history of the human race built itself up, flourished, collapsed, rebuilt, flourished again, got conquered, adapted, survived, and left behind more mysteries than any other culture we know of. That civilization is ancient Egypt. And here's the thing about ancient Egypt that gets me every time. We know so much about it, more than almost any other ancient civilization. The Egyptians were obsessed with recording things. On papyrus, on tomb walls, on temple ceilings, on massive stone monuments built to last forever. They wrote down the names of their kings and the deeds of their gods and the prices of grain in the markets and the love poems people gave each other and the medical treatments they used and the prayers they said before bed. They left us an enormous record, and yet somehow, the more we know, the more mysterious Egypt becomes. Every answer generates 3 more questions. Every tomb that gets opened reveals something that nobody expected. Every inscription that gets translated contains something that makes scholars argue for decades. Egypt is the gift that keeps on giving, in the best possible way. Okay, get comfortable, dim your lights. If you have a fan, now is the time. Find your pillow, find your blanket, find your position. Tonight, we are going deep into ancient Egypt. We are going to talk about the Nile and the pharaohs and the pyramids and the gods and the mummies and the curses and the mysteries that nobody, not Egyptologists, not archaeologists, not the most sophisticated scanning technology available today, has been able to fully explain. There's going to be a boy king who died young and strange. There's going to be a female pharaoh that her own son tried to erase from history. There's going to be a heretic king who threw out all the gods and replaced them with one. There's going to be a pyramid that was built with such mathematical precision that modern engineers are still arguing about how. There's going to be a Sphinx that's been sitting in the desert for 4,000 years with its nose missing and its secrets intact. And there's going to be a lot of stuff that nobody can explain. This is a History for Sleep episode. The lights are low, the pace is easy. The story is 3,000 years long, and it never gets boring. Let's start at the beginning, which in Egypt's case is the river. Herodotus, the Greek historian who visited Egypt around 450 BCE, called Egypt the gift of the Nile. He was not wrong. To understand ancient Egypt, to understand why it existed, why it survived for 3,000 years, why it produced the things it produced, you have to understand the Nile. The Nile is the longest river in the world. It runs roughly 4,000 miles from its sources in the highlands of Central Africa to its delta on the Mediterranean coast. The last section, the part that runs through Egypt, flows north through the Sahara Desert, one of the most inhospitable environments on Earth. Without the Nile, Egypt is sand. With the Nile, Egypt is one of the most agriculturally productive strips of land in the ancient world. Here's how it worked. Every year, without fail, the Nile flooded. The floods came from summer rains in the Ethiopian highlands, thousands of miles to the south. The water rushed north, carrying enormous amounts of silt, fine, dark, incredibly fertile soil washed down from the mountains. When the floods peaked and then receded, they left that silt deposited across the floodplain. The Egyptians called this black land Kemet, the dark, fertile soil of the flood deposits. Everything beyond it, the desert, the wasteland, the place where nothing grew and nothing lived, they called the Red Land. Deshret, Kemet and Deshret, life and death, the two lands, always present, always defining Egyptian existence. The Nile flood was so central to Egyptian life that the entire agricultural calendar was organized around it. 3 seasons, not 4. The inundation season, when the floods came, the growing season when the waters receded and crops were planted in the rich soil, and the harvest season, when everything was gathered before the cycle began again. This predictability was everything. In most of the ancient world, agriculture was a gamble. Rain might come or it might not. Crops might grow or they might fail. But in Egypt, the flood came every year. It had come every year for thousands of years before the first pharaoh. It would come every year for thousands of years after. You could plan around it. You could build a civilization around it. And that's exactly what the Egyptians did. The geography of Egypt also provided something else that most civilizations lacked: natural protection. To the east and west, the Sahara Desert made large-scale invasion almost impossible. To the north, the Mediterranean Sea provided a barrier and a trade route in equal measure. To the south, a series of cataracts, stretches of rough water and rapids, made navigation difficult and helped control who could move in and out. Egypt was, in a sense, a fortress built by nature, protected on 3 sides by desert and sea, with only the Nile Valley as the route of approach. An army trying to invade Egypt from the west would have to cross hundreds of miles of waterless desert. An army trying to invade from the east would face the Sinai Peninsula and more desert. This protection allowed Egyptian civilization to develop in relative stability for long stretches of time. While other civilizations in the ancient world were constantly being overrun, disrupted, and rebuilt by successive waves of conquerors, Egypt just kept going. Sometimes it was conquered, sometimes it fell into periods of chaos and fragmentation, but it always came back. The Nile kept flooding, the silt kept coming, the black land kept producing, and Egypt kept existing. The Nile also made something else possible that was crucial for the development of a complex civilization: surplus. When your agricultural system is reliable enough to produce more food than the farmers themselves need to eat, you can feed people who do other things: scribes, priests, soldiers, architects, craftsmen, artists, astronomers. You can build monuments. The pyramids were not built by slaves, despite what centuries of popular mythology have suggested. They were built by organized crews of skilled workers who were fed and housed and paid. Workers whose food was grown in the rich Nile floodplain by farmers who produced more than they needed. The Nile made the pyramids possible. The Nile made ancient Egypt possible. Everything else flows from the river. Egypt didn't spring into existence fully formed. Before the pharaohs, before the pyramids, before the hieroglyphs and the temples and the elaborate burial rituals, there was a long period of development that most people never hear about. Archaeologists call it the pre-dynastic period. It covers roughly the 5,000 years before the first pharaoh, during which the people who would become the ancient Egyptians were slowly figuring out how to live in the Nile Valley and developing the cultural and technological foundations that would eventually produce one of the greatest civilizations in history. The earliest human presence in what is now Egypt goes back much further. There is evidence of human activity along the Nile going back hundreds of thousands of years. But the story of ancient Egyptian civilization really begins around 5000 BCE, when communities along the Nile started to shift from a nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyle to settled agriculture. These early communities were not yet Egyptian in the way we think of it. They were regional cultures with distinct identities, each developing along the Nile in relative isolation. In the south, Upper Egypt, the Nagada culture emerged as one of the most important. In the north, Lower Egypt, the Delta region, different groups were developing their own traditions. Over thousands of years, these cultures began to interact more, through trade, through conflict, through the gradual movement of people along the river. And as they interacted, certain cultural elements began to spread and standardize. Pottery, burial practices, trade goods, artistic styles. The Egyptians were decorating their pottery with recognizable motifs, boats, animals, humans. Long before they developed writing, they were burying their dead with grave goods, food, tools, personal items, suggesting a belief in some kind of afterlife long before the elaborate mythology of the Book of the Dead. One of the most significant discoveries from this period is the Ghebeline pre-dynastic mummies, found at a site called Ghebeline in southern Egypt. These are 6 naturally mummified bodies dating to around 3500 BCE, more than 500 years before the first pharaoh. They were mummified not by any elaborate process, but simply by the dry desert sand which preserved them with remarkable completeness. One of them, a young man, probably in his late teens or early 20s, shows clear evidence of a stab wound to his back. He was murdered. Someone killed this person 3,500 years before the Common Era, and we can still see the evidence on his preserved body. His name is unknown, his story is unknown, but he is real and he is old, and he reminds you that ancient Egypt was not just monuments and pharaohs. It was people living and dying and occasionally killing each other, long before anyone had thought of building a pyramid. Around 3,200 to 3,100 BCE, something began to change. The regional cultures of Upper and Lower Egypt started to come into increasing conflict. Upper Egypt, with its more unified political structure, began to expand northward. Warfare, conquest, absorption. The process was probably messy and complicated and stretched over decades or even centuries, but at the end of it, sometime around 3100 BCE, Egypt was unified. One political entity stretching from the First Cataract in the south to the Mediterranean coast in the north. One kingdom, one king. The legendary figure credited with this unification is called Nama, or possibly Menes. The sources are frustratingly unclear on whether these are 2 different people or 2 names for the same person. What we have is the Nama palette, a carved ceremonial object discovered in 1898 at Hierakonpolis. On one side, a large figure wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt smites a kneeling enemy. On the other side, the same figure wears the red crown of Lower Egypt, inspecting rows of decapitated enemies. It is possibly the earliest historical document in the world, a record of conquest, of unification, of the moment Egypt became Egypt. The man on the pallet, whoever he was the first pharaoh, and everything begins with him. The word pharaoh is actually a later term. It comes from the Egyptian phrase per-au-ah, meaning great house, a reference to the royal palace. The Egyptians themselves didn't commonly use it to refer to their kings until around 1000 BCE, but we use it for all of them, because it's the word that has stuck. The first pharaohs of a unified Egypt ruled during what Egyptologists call the early dynastic period, roughly 3100 to 2686 BCE. This is the time when Egyptian civilization was still figuring out what it was, when the institutions, the artistic styles, the religious beliefs, the bureaucratic structures that would define Egypt for the next 3,000 years were being established for the first time. These early kings, Nama and his successors in the first and second dynasties, were doing something extraordinarily difficult. They were trying to hold together a long, narrow country, stretching for hundreds of miles, with a population that still had distinct regional identities and loyalties. A country that had been multiple, separate entities until very recently. They did this through several mechanisms. The first was the ideology of kingship. The pharaoh was not just a political leader, he was a divine being. Specifically, he was the living embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, the god of the sky and of kingship. When a pharaoh died, he became Osiris, the god of the dead and of resurrection. His successor became the new Horus. This ideology made the pharaoh's authority absolute and sacred in a way that pure political power never could. You didn't just obey the pharaoh because he had a big army. You obeyed him because he was a god. The second mechanism was the bureaucracy. Egypt developed very early a sophisticated administrative system. Scribes who could read and write, a skill that was rare and valuable, were employed to keep records, manage resources, collect taxes, and administer the state's vast enterprises. The pharaoh could not personally manage a kingdom stretching hundreds of miles. He needed administrators, and he developed a class of them. The third mechanism was the royal tomb. The early pharaohs were buried at a site called Abydos in Upper Egypt, a place considered sacred, the mythological burial place of Osiris himself. Their tombs were massive mud brick structures surrounded by rows of subsidiary burials, human sacrifices, servants, officials, craftsmen, sometimes dozens of them, killed and buried alongside the pharaoh so that they could serve him in the afterlife. This practice, retainer sacrifice, continued for the first 2 dynasties and then stopped. We don't know exactly why. Possibly it became too expensive. Possibly the ideology of the afterlife shifted. Possibly someone decided that killing hundreds of people every time a king died was an unsustainable policy. Whatever the reason, by the time of the Old Kingdom, the practice had been replaced by shabtis, small figurines that would magically serve the deceased in the afterlife. Much more practical. The tombs at Abydos have yielded extraordinary finds, including the earliest examples of hieroglyphic writing. Small labels attached to grave goods bearing the names of kings and the quantities of items. The writing is already recognizable as Egyptian. The distinctive combination of pictures that represent sounds and pictures that represent ideas, a system that would remain essentially unchanged for 3,000 years. 3,000 years. Think about that for a second. The English language as we speak it today is barely 1,000 years old. The writing system of ancient Egypt, in its basic form, lasted 3 times that long. If you could transport a scribe from the reign of the last pharaoh back to the first dynasty, the writing would look different. The hieroglyphic signs evolved over time, but the fundamental system would be recognizable. That's a level of cultural continuity that is almost incomprehensible to us. By the end of the Second Dynasty, Egypt was a functioning, literate, administratively complex state. The foundations were in place, the ideology was established, the writing was being used, the bureaucracy was operating, and then came the Old Kingdom, and everything got bigger. The Old Kingdom lasted from roughly 2686 to 2181 BCE. That's about 500 years. During those 500 years, Egypt built the pyramids. Not just some pyramids, the pyramids, Giza, Saqqara, Dashur, the most recognizable monuments in the history of human construction. Let's set the scene. Egypt in the Old Kingdom was a wealthy, stable, highly organized state. The pharaoh's power was essentially absolute. The agricultural surplus of the Nile Valley was being extracted and redistributed by an efficient bureaucracy. The population was growing. The technology was advancing, and the pharaohs were obsessed with one thing: their tombs. This obsession makes more sense when you understand Egyptian cosmology. The Egyptians believed in an afterlife, but not in the vague, spiritual way that many modern people think of it. They believed in a very specific, very physical afterlife. The deceased person continued to exist and needed their body to do it, which is why mummification was so important. The body had to be preserved. They also needed food and clothing and tools and their name and their image, which is why tomb walls were covered with representations of all these things. The pharaoh's afterlife was of particular cosmic importance because the pharaoh was a god. His continued existence after death, his successful resurrection as Osiris, his continued journey through the underworld was essential for the maintenance of cosmic order. If the pharaoh's afterlife failed, the universe itself was at risk. This is why the pyramid was not just a big tomb, it was a machine for the afterlife. Every element of its design served a religious purpose. The alignment, the passages, the chambers, the texts on the walls of later pyramids, the pyramid texts, the oldest religious texts in the world, were spells and instructions to guide the deceased pharaoh through the dangers of the underworld and into eternal life. The pyramid was also a statement of power, of resources, of organizational ability. Building a pyramid required tens of thousands of workers, enormous quantities of stone, sophisticated logistics, precise surveying, and years or decades of sustained effort. Only a state of extraordinary wealth and organizational capacity could do it. The Old Kingdom was that state. The pyramid building sequence starts before Giza. The first pyramid was built for the pharaoh Djoser at Saqqara around 2650 BCE. It's called the Step Pyramid, a series of mastabas, the rectangular flat-top tombs that preceded pyramids, stacked on top of each other in diminishing tiers. It was designed by a man named Imhotep, who would later be deified turned into a god because the Egyptians apparently decided that anyone who could design something that extraordinary must have had divine help. The step pyramid was revolutionary. It was the first large stone structure in the history of the world. Before this, large buildings were made of mud brick. Imhotep chose stone, and not just any stone, but fine quality limestone, quarried and transported and precisely cut. The complex surrounding the pyramid covered about 40 acres. It was a complete funerary city, with courtyards and temples and storage buildings, all enclosed by a massive wall. After Djoser, the pharaohs of the 4th dynasty refined and perfected the pyramid form. Sneferu, the first pharaoh of the 4th dynasty, built 3 pyramids, more than any other pharaoh in history. His first attempt, the bent pyramid at Dashur, changed its angle of inclination partway through construction, giving it a distinctive shape that suggests the builders realized the original angle was too steep. His second attempt, the red pyramid, also at Dashur, is the first true smooth-sided pyramid, and then came Sneferu's son, Khufu, and Giza. The Great Pyramid of Giza was built for Khufu around 2560 BCE, for nearly 4,000 years until the construction of the Lincoln Cathedral in England in 1311 CE. It was the tallest structure in the world. It is the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world still standing. Its statistics are staggering. Originally about 481 feet tall, a base covering 13 acres, built from approximately 2.3 million stone blocks, weighing on average 2.5 to 15 tons each, with some blocks in the interior weighing as much as 80 tons. The outer casing stones, now mostly gone, stripped for building material in the medieval period, were polished white limestone that would have made the pyramid gleam in the Egyptian sun like a mirror. The precision is what gets most people. The base of the Great Pyramid is level to within 2.1 centimeters across its entire 756-foot length. The 4 sides are oriented to true north, south, east, and west, with an accuracy of less than 0.05 degrees. The corners are almost perfect right angles. This precision was achieved without GPS, without computers, without modern surveying equipment, by people using ropes and water levels and star sightings 4,500 years ago. How? That's the question. And we'll spend a whole section on it. This is the question everyone asks. And the honest answer is, we don't know for certain. We have theories. We have archaeological evidence. We have experimental archaeology. People actually trying to build sections of pyramids using only ancient tools and methods. We have tomb paintings showing construction work. We have administrative papyri that describe the logistics of pyramid construction, but we don't have a complete, step-by-step, this is exactly how they did it answer, and probably never will. Let's start with what we do know. We know who built them, not slaves. This is one of the most persistent myths about ancient Egypt, and it's wrong. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after the pyramids were built, claimed they were built by slave labor. And his account, filtered through centuries of biblical imagery of Hebrew slaves in Egypt, shaped the popular image of pyramid construction for millennia. The archaeology says otherwise. In 1990, a construction accident near the Giza Plateau uncovered a cemetery. It turned out to be the burial ground of the pyramid workers, and it was a proper cemetery, not a slave pit, not a mass grave, but organized tombs with grave goods, sometimes with inscriptions recording the workers' names and titles. The workers were organized into named gangs. They had titles. They received medical care. Skeletons from the cemetery show healed fractures and evidence of surgical intervention. They were fed well. Animal bones found in the workers' village suggest they ate beef, which was a high-status food in ancient Egypt. They were housed in purpose-built villages. These were not slaves. These were workers doing a job for the state, possibly as a form of labor tax, the way peasants in many ancient societies owed the state a certain amount of labor time. Some were permanent skilled workers. Others were probably rotating crews of agricultural laborers working during the flood season, when the fields were underwater and there was nothing to farm. The pyramid-building workforce has been estimated at around 20,000 to 30,000 people at peak activity, not the hundreds of thousands that Herodotus claimed, but still an enormous coordinated workforce for the ancient world. Now, how did they actually move and place the stones? The quarrying is the part we understand best. The limestone used for the bulk of the pyramid was quarried locally. There is a massive quarry immediately south of the Giza Plateau. The higher quality limestone used for the outer casing came from Tura, across the river, and the granite used for the inner chambers and the king's sarcophagus came from Aswan, about 500 miles to the south. Moving the stones from the quarries to the construction site involved sledges, large wooden sleds that the stones were lashed to and dragged across the ground. We have tomb paintings showing this process, and experimental work has confirmed it's feasible. For lubrication, water was poured in front of the sled to reduce friction. There's even a tomb painting that shows a worker pouring water from a vessel directly in front of a large sled carrying a statue. Getting the stones up as the pyramid rose is the harder question. The most widely accepted theory is ramps. Some kind of ramp system that allowed the sledges to be dragged up to the level where the stones were being placed. The debate is about what kind of ramp. A single straight ramp extending out from one face of the pyramid would have had to be almost as long as the pyramid is tall to maintain a workable angle, an enormous construction project in itself. A spiral ramp wrapping around the pyramid has also been proposed, but this would have made it almost impossible to check the corners and maintain accuracy. A more recent theory, proposed by architect Jean-Pierre Houdin, suggests an external ramp was used for the lower two-thirds of the pyramid, and then an internal spiral ramp, still partially visible in the structure, some argue, was used for the upper third. This theory has some support, but remains unproven. In 2017, a remarkable discovery was made at the site of the ancient quarry at Hatnub. A ramp system was found, a central staircase with two staircases on either side, with post holes that would have held wooden posts and ropes. This kind of system would have allowed workers to haul a sled up a steep incline using ropes running through pulley-like mechanisms. It suggests the Egyptians may have had more sophisticated ramp technology than previously assumed. The alignment and precision are equally mysterious. How did the Egyptians orient the Great Pyramid to true north with such extraordinary accuracy? One theory involves the circumpolar stars, stars that never set from the perspective of Egyptian latitudes. By bisecting the arc of a circumpolar star as it moved around the celestial pole, a surveyor could identify true north with great precision. A recently proposed theory suggests they used a specific method involving the rising and setting of stars to define the north-south line. Neither theory has been definitively proven. The leveling of the base, level to within 2 centimeters across 13 acres, may have been achieved using channels filled with water. Water, in a connected channel system, finds its own level. A grid of shallow water channels cut across the base of the pyramid site would have created a precise level reference. The rock between the channels would then be cut down to match the water level. Simple, elegant, effective, but still extraordinary. The pyramids of Giza were built by human beings using hand tools, ropes, sledges, ramps, and an exceptional capacity for organization. They were not built by aliens. They were not built by a lost advanced civilization. They were built by Egyptians, specifically by the Old Kingdom Egyptians of the 4th dynasty, through a combination of engineering knowledge, logistical skill, and sheer sustained effort that we are still struggling to fully comprehend. And they have lasted 4,500 years. Sitting on the Giza Plateau, just to the east of the pyramids, is one of the most famous and most argued about monuments in the ancient world, the Great Sphinx. It is enormous. Carved from a single outcrop of limestone bedrock, it stretches 240 feet long and stands 66 feet high. The body is that of a lion, or possibly a dog, depending on how you look at it, in a recumbent position. The head is human, wearing the royal Nemes headdress, the striped cloth that was a symbol of pharaonic power. The face has been damaged. The nose is missing, broken off at some point in history, though exactly when and how is disputed. Medieval Arab accounts suggest it was deliberately broken off by a religious zealot offended by the sculpture. Other theories involve Napoleonic cannons, which is almost certainly false. Napoleon's soldiers weren't shooting at the Sphinx, and descriptions from before Napoleon already mention the missing nose. The Sphinx faces due east, toward the rising sun. In the tradition of Egyptian solar religion, this is significant. The rising sun was associated with rebirth and renewal, and many Egyptian monuments and temples were oriented toward it. Who built it? Almost certainly Khafra, the pharaoh who built the second largest pyramid at Giza. A small sphinx bearing Khafra's face was found nearby, and the face of the Great Sphinx, to the extent that it can still be read, appears to resemble Khafra more than any other pharaoh. But here's where it gets interesting. The Sphinx is older than most people think, or possibly much older. This is one of the most heated debates in Egyptology, and it involves water. The body of the Sphinx and the walls of the enclosure surrounding it show a distinctive pattern of erosion. Rather than the wind erosion that you'd expect from thousands of years in the Egyptian desert, they show what geologist Robert Schoch, and he's not alone in this, argues is water erosion. Specifically, the kind of deep, rounded channels that form when heavy rainfall runs down vertical surfaces. The problem with this theory is that Egypt hasn't had significant rainfall in the Nile Valley region for around 9,000 or 10,000 years. If the Sphinx shows rainfall erosion, that would push its construction back to before 7000 BCE, long before any Egyptian civilization as we know it existed. Most Egyptologists reject this conclusion, arguing that the erosion patterns can be explained by other processes, or that the dating of the humid period is uncertain. The debate between geologists and Egyptologists has been going on since the 1990s and shows no sign of resolving. What's buried under the Sphinx? This is another contested question. Seismic surveys conducted in the 1990s detected what appeared to be cavities beneath and around the Sphinx, hollow spaces in the rock. Some researchers have interpreted these as evidence of hidden chambers, possibly containing lost knowledge or artifacts. Others argue they're simply natural features of the limestone. The Egyptian authorities have been reluctant to allow extensive excavation around the Sphinx. This reluctance has itself become the subject of conspiracy theories. The truth is probably more mundane. Excavation carries real risks of damaging the monument, and the Egyptian government has legitimate reasons for being cautious about what goes on around one of their most iconic landmarks. But the chambers, if they exist, have never been fully explored. The Sphinx also originally had a beard. Fragments of a carved stone beard have been found near the monument, and ancient paintings show the Sphinx with a beard. This beard was apparently added after the original construction, possibly during the New Kingdom period. The Sphinx also had a different appearance when it was first created. The head is disproportionately small relative to the body, noticeably so when you look at it carefully. One theory proposed by geologist Colin Reeder, among others, is that the head was recarved at some point, reducing its size. If the original head was larger, it might have been the head of a lion rather than a human, or a different pharaoh's face. This theory would explain the proportional oddness, but remains speculative. What we know for certain about the Sphinx, it is very old, very large, very impressive, and full of unresolved questions. The more carefully you look at it, the less certain you are that you understand what you're seeing. Which, you could argue, is the most Egyptian thing about it. Here's something that doesn't get enough attention when people talk about ancient Egypt. Most of the royal mummies are missing, not all of them. We have quite a few, the mummies of Rameses II, Seti I, Thutmose III, Amenhotep II and others were found in two caches, one discovered in 1881 near Deir el-Bahri, one discovered in 1898 in the tomb of Amenhotep II. These caches represent mummies that ancient Egyptian priests moved and reburied during periods of tomb robbery to keep them safe. But there are many pharaohs whose mummies have never been found. Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, his mummy is gone. Khafra's mummy, gone. Menkaura's mummy, gone. Thutmose I, uncertain. Akhenaten, possibly identified, possibly not. Nefertiti, unknown. Alexander the Great was supposedly buried in Egypt in Alexandria, and his tomb has never been found. Where did they go? The short answer is robbery. The long answer is more complicated. Tomb robbery was a massive problem in ancient Egypt, and it started almost immediately after the royal burials. Some of the earliest royal tombs at Abydos were robbed within decades of being sealed. The Great Pyramid itself was already empty when Arab Caliph Al-Ma'mun tunneled into it in 820 CE. It had been robbed in antiquity. The Egyptians tried to address this problem by making their tombs more elaborate, more hidden, more booby-trapped. The shift from pyramid tombs to hidden tombs, cut into the cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, which began with the New Kingdom, was largely a response to the persistent problem of theft. But even the Valley of the Kings tombs were robbed, many of them in antiquity, some within decades of being sealed. We know this from ancient records. There are surviving papyri from around 1100 BCE that document a royal commission to investigate tomb robberies in the valley. The testimony of the accused robbers, recorded in painful detail, describes breaking into tombs and stripping the mummies of their gold and jewellery. When the robbers stripped a mummy, they usually destroyed it in the process. Gold was everywhere on a royal mummy. Golden face masks, golden jewellery, golden amulets wrapped into the bandages. Getting the gold meant unwrapping or tearing apart the mummy. Some mummies were burned by robbers, either accidentally or deliberately. Some were simply discarded, left exposed to the elements. The priests, who periodically checked on the royal mummies, whose job it was to maintain the royal cults, documented what they found in the post-robbery inspections. Some of these inspection records survive. They describe finding mummies damaged, unwrapped, scattered. They describe re-wrapping and reburying what was left. Eventually, in the face of systematic and unstoppable robbery, the priests of the late New Kingdom made a drastic decision. They systematically collected as many royal mummies as they could find, rewrapped them, labelled them, and hid them in secret caches. This is how the Deir el-Bahri cache came to contain the mummies of 30-some pharaohs. They were essentially refugees from their own tombs, rescued from robbery and stored in secret. But not all of them made it. Many mummies were robbed and destroyed before the priests could save them. Others were hidden in locations that have never been found. Khufu's mummy may simply be dust, destroyed by ancient robbers so thoroughly that nothing was left. Or it may be somewhere we haven't looked yet. The Valley of the Kings has been the most intensively studied archaeological site in the world for well over a century. And yet, in 2005, Cave I-63, Tomb 63 in the valley, was discovered containing a collection of embalming materials and 7 coffins. In 2022, a remarkable discovery near Luxor revealed a 3,000-year-old city that had lain undiscovered under the sand, almost perfectly preserved. Egypt keeps surprising us. There may be royal mummies still out there. One in particular keeps Egyptologists awake at night. Nefertiti, the wife of Akhenaten, arguably the most beautiful face in ancient Egyptian art, a woman who appears to have wielded extraordinary power during her lifetime. Her mummy has never been conclusively identified. Some Egyptologists believe she may be the mummy designated KV35YL, the so-called younger lady, found in the tomb of Amenhotep II. DNA analysis has established that this mummy was the mother of Tutankhamun, and a current consensus is that this was indeed Nefertiti, or possibly Kia, another of Akhenaten's wives. But it's not proven. Not definitively. Not in a way that settles the question. Nefertiti may be lying in a museum somewhere, unrecognized. She may be in a tomb we haven't found yet. She may have been destroyed by ancient robbers. We don't know. The Old Kingdom, the age of pyramid building, the age of absolute pharaonic power, collapsed around 2181 BCE. Nobody completely agrees on why. The end of the Old Kingdom, specifically the collapse after the reign of Pepi II, who ruled for about 94 years and is believed to have been the longest reigning monarch in history, is one of the great mysteries of ancient Egyptian history. The state fragmented, central authority collapsed. Regional governors, nomarchs, became effectively independent rulers. The elaborate system of tax collection and labor organization that had built the pyramids simply stopped functioning. There were famines. We know this from inscriptions left by local officials describing desperate conditions, people eating their children, the strong preying on the weak. Climate change may have been involved. There is evidence that a prolonged drought struck the entire eastern Mediterranean region around this time, disrupting the Nile floods and destroying the agricultural surplus that the state depended on. The period that followed, the first intermediate period, lasted about 140 years. It is poorly documented, chaotic, and represents one of the low points of Egyptian civilization. Tombs were robbed, monuments were damaged, the ideological framework of divine pharaonic kingship was shaken. And then Egypt put itself back together. A series of princes from the city of Thebes in Upper Egypt gradually reunified the country, culminating in the pharaoh Mentuhotep II, who had consolidated control over all of Egypt by around 2055 BCE. The Middle Kingdom had begun. The Middle Kingdom, roughly 2055 to 1650 BCE, is in many ways the most interesting period of ancient Egyptian history, and the most overlooked. It doesn't have the spectacular pyramid building of the Old Kingdom or the imperial grandeur of the New Kingdom. But it has something more subtle and, in some ways, more remarkable. It has literature. The literary tradition of the Middle Kingdom produced some of the most sophisticated writing in ancient Egyptian history. The story of Sinuhe, a tale of an Egyptian official who flees Egypt after a political crisis, lives among foreigners for decades, and eventually returns home, is considered the masterpiece of Egyptian literature. It has been compared to Homer. It survives in multiple copies and was clearly read and enjoyed across centuries. The dialogue of a man with his soul, also known as the dispute of a man who contemplates suicide with his bar, is a philosophical text exploring the meaning of life, the nature of death, and the worth of continued existence. It is profound, complex, and deeply human. These texts reveal something important about Middle Kingdom Egypt. It was a culture that had been through trauma and was thinking carefully about what it meant to be alive, what loyalty and identity meant, what made life worth living. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs were different from their Old Kingdom predecessors. The ideology of absolute, remote, god-like kingship that had characterized the Old Kingdom was tempered. The Middle Kingdom pharaohs are depicted differently in their statuary. Their faces often show weariness, concern, the weight of responsibility. They look like people carrying a heavy burden, not gods dispensing favor from on high. This shift is usually attributed to the political experience of the first intermediate period. The collapse of the Old Kingdom had made it impossible to pretend that the pharaoh's divine power was automatically self-sustaining. Power now required justification, effort, the active engagement of the king with the welfare of his people. One inscription from the period, left by a Middle Kingdom official, lists his accomplishments in terms of how he helped his people. He never let anyone go hungry. He never let a widow be oppressed. He clothed the naked. He ferried the stranded traveller across the river. This is a different kind of kingship ideology from the old kingdom's pyramid-building glorification. It's closer to the concept of the Good Shepherd, power justified by service. The Middle Kingdom also saw significant expansion southward into Nubia, the region to the south of the First Cataract, corresponding roughly to modern Sudan. The Nubian campaigns brought gold, ebony, and other luxury goods into Egypt and established Egyptian control over important trade routes. And then, around 1650 BCE, Egypt was invaded. The Hyksos, a Semitic people from the Levant, swept into the delta region of Lower Egypt and established their own kingdom. For the first time in its history, a significant part of Egypt was ruled by foreigners. The Egyptians were appalled. The shock and humiliation of foreign rule would shape Egyptian foreign policy for centuries afterward, and the response to the Hyksos would launch one of the most dramatic periods in Egyptian history. Before we get to the response to the Hyksos, we need to talk about a woman. Hatshepsut is one of the most fascinating figures in ancient Egyptian history, and for a long time she was one of the most invisible because someone tried very hard to erase her. She lived during the New Kingdom, the period that followed the expulsion of the Hyksos. The New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, is the Egypt of most people's imagination. The Valley of the Kings, the temple complexes at Karnak and Luxor, the great warrior pharaohs, the imperial expansion into Nubia and the Levant, the wealth and splendor at its peak. Hatshepsut came to power around 1473 BCE. She was the daughter of the pharaoh Thutmose I, the widow of Thutmose II and the stepmother of Thutmose III, who was the legitimate heir, but was too young to rule when his father died. In Egyptian tradition, a regent ruled on behalf of a child king until he came of age. Hatshepsut was appointed as regent for the young Thutmose III, and then, after a few years, she stopped being a regent. She became pharaoh. Not queen, not regent, pharaoh. She adopted the full titulary of a male pharaoh, the 5 names that identified the king as the embodiment of divine power. She was depicted in statuary and relief, wearing the false beard and the double crown, and the kilt that were the standard iconography of the pharaoh. She called herself with male pronouns in some inscriptions and female pronouns in others, suggesting that the category of pharaoh was simply too male-coded for the language to fully accommodate a woman in the role. How did she manage this? There are a few theories. One is that she had powerful supporters in the priesthood of Amun, the state god of the New Kingdom, who backed her transition from regent to full pharaoh for political reasons. Another is that Thutmose III was simply too young and too politically weak to challenge her for a long time. A third is that she was simply forceful and capable enough to make it work. Whatever the mechanism, Hatshepsut ruled as pharaoh for about 20 years, and she was a good pharaoh. She organized one of the most celebrated trading expeditions in Egyptian history, a voyage to the land of Punt, a mysterious place believed to be somewhere on the coast of East Africa or the Arabian Peninsula. The expedition returned with myrrh trees for the temple gardens, incense, ebony, gold, and live animals, including baboons. She oversaw massive building projects. The temple at Deir el-Bahri, built into the cliffs on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, is one of the most beautiful buildings in Egypt. Its 3 colonnaded terraces rising against the golden cliff face are a masterpiece of New Kingdom architecture. Even in ruins, it is extraordinary. She expanded trade. She kept the empire stable. By most measurable standards, her reign was a success. And then she died, probably around 1458 BCE, and Thutmose III, who had been co-ruling with her, and who was now old enough to rule alone, became sole pharaoh. He went on to become one of the greatest military pharaohs in Egyptian history, leading 17 campaigns in the Levant and expanding the empire to its greatest extent. Late in his reign, or possibly early in the reign of his son Amenhotep II, something systematic happened. Hatshepsut's name was chiseled off monuments, her statues were smashed and buried in pits, her image was removed from reliefs and replaced with images of Thutmose I, Thutmose II, or Thutmose III. Her temple was not destroyed, but her presence in it was methodically eliminated wherever possible. For centuries afterward, Hatshepsut essentially didn't exist. The king lists compiled by later Egyptians skip from Thutmose II to Thutmose III, with no mention of a female pharaoh in between. When Egyptologists in the 19th century began to work through the inscriptions at Deir el-Bahri and encountered references to a pharaoh who seemed to be female, they were confused. The concept was so outside their expectations that some of them initially assumed the gender markers in the texts were simply mistakes. Gradually, through the painstaking work of scholars including Edouard Neville and later Herbert Winlock, Hatshepsut was reconstructed. Her statue fragments, smashed and buried in a pit at Deir el-Bahri, were reassembled. Thousands of pieces painstakingly fitted together over decades, producing images of a female pharaoh kneeling in offering or sitting in majesty. The motive for the erasure is debated. The most obvious explanation, revenge, personal animosity between stepmother and stepson, doesn't entirely fit the evidence, because the erasure happened late in Thutmose III's reign, decades after Hatshepsut's death. If he hated her, why wait 20 years to erase her? The more nuanced explanation involves succession politics. Thutmose III was establishing the legitimacy of his own line. Specifically, he was probably trying to ensure the smooth succession of his own son, Amenhotep II. A female pharaoh in the recent past was an anomaly that could be used to question the rules of royal succession. By erasing Hatshepsut, Thutmose was not so much expressing personal hatred as performing a political act, tidying the historical record to eliminate a precedent that made the rules of pharaonic succession look complicated. Whatever the motive, the attempt ultimately failed. Hatshepsut came back. 3,000 years later, she is one of the most famous figures in Egyptian history. Her temple is one of the most visited sites in Egypt. Her mummy, identified in 2007 through DNA analysis and a study of a tooth found in a box bearing her name, is in the Cairo Museum. She was erased and she survived it. That's a Hatshepsut kind of outcome. If Hatshepsut is the pharaoh who was erased, Akhenaten is the pharaoh who erased himself, in the sense that everything about his reign was so outside the norms of Egyptian tradition that the Egyptians themselves, after his death, treated it as a kind of collective memory lapse they preferred to forget. Akhenaten ruled Egypt from roughly 1353 to 1336 BCE. He is one of the most analysed, most argued about, most theorised about figures in ancient Egyptian history. He has been called the world's first monotheist. He has been called a revolutionary. He has been called a madman. He has been linked, through speculation, that has no solid evidential basis but is endlessly compelling, to Moses, to the origins of Judaism, to hidden religious traditions that supposedly survived his death. What is certain is that he did something nobody in Egypt had done before and nobody would do again. He changed the religion. Egyptian religion, as we'll discuss in more detail later, was extraordinarily complex. A vast pantheon of gods, hundreds of them, with different attributes, different myths, different cult centers, different priesthoods. This complexity had evolved over thousands of years. By the New Kingdom, it was deeply embedded in every aspect of Egyptian life and administered by a powerful institutional church. Akhenaten rejected almost all of it. He declared that there was one god, the Aten. Not Aten as one god among many, but Aten as the only god, the sole creator and sustainer of the universe, whose physical manifestation was the disk of the sun. He dismantled the cults of the other gods. He closed temples. He defaced the names of other deities, particularly Amun, the chief state god, from monuments across Egypt. He redirected the enormous wealth that had been flowing to the temples of the traditional gods toward the cult of the Aten. He built a new capital city. On virgin ground, on a plain on the east bank of the Nile, about midway between Thebes and Memphis, he constructed a city from scratch, Akhetaten, which we call Amarna today. He declared that no city had been built here before, that no god had been worshipped here before, and that the city was a gift from the Aten himself. In the hymn to the Aten, attributed to Akhenaten himself and found in the tombs of his officials at Amarna, there are passages of genuine poetic beauty. The sun rises, and the world awakens. The sun sets, and the world sleeps. The Aten created all living things, the people of Egypt, and also the people of foreign lands, because the Aten is the god of all humanity, not just of Egypt. This universalism, the idea that one god was the god of all people, was genuinely unusual in the ancient world, where gods were typically understood as belonging to specific peoples or places. Whether this makes Akhenaten a monotheist in the modern sense is debated. The Aten was not an invisible, transcendent god in the way that later monotheistic traditions would understand God. The Aten was the physical sun disk. Akhenaten himself was the mediator between the Aten and humanity, the only person who could truly access the divine. In some ways, Akhenaten replaced the traditional pantheon not with pure monotheism, but with a theology centered on himself as the sole interpreter of the one God. The personal appearance of Akhenaten as depicted in art is strange and distinctive. He's shown with an elongated skull, a long face, a protruding belly, wide hips, and spindly limbs. This is so different from the standard idealized depiction of pharaohs that it has prompted endless medical speculation. Marfan syndrome, Froelich syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, the list of diagnoses that various scholars have proposed is long. The current consensus among Egyptologists is that the distinctive artistic style of the Amarna period was a deliberate artistic choice, a new aesthetic that accompanied the new religion, representing Akhenaten in a non-standard way as part of the revolutionary program of his reign, not medical reality but theological statement. His wife was Nefertiti, whose famous bust, found at Amarna and now in the Neues Museum in Berlin, is one of the most reproduced images in ancient history. Nefertiti appears to have wielded significant religious and political power during Akhenaten's reign, depicted in art as almost his equal, which was itself highly unusual. Akhenaten ruled for about 17 years, and then he died, or disappeared. The manner of his death is unknown. His immediate successors tried to gradually undo the damage. The young pharaoh who followed shortly after, originally named Tutankhamun, living image of the Aten, changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, moved the court back to Thebes, reopened the traditional temples, and began the process of restoration. The full erasure came later, under the general Horemheb, who became pharaoh at the end of the 18th dynasty. Horemheb dismantled the temples at Amarna. He used the stone as fill material in his own building projects. He smashed the royal statues. He removed Akhenaten's name from the king lists, along with the names of his immediate successors. Like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten was supposed to be forgotten. Unlike Hatshepsut, who disappeared cleanly, Akhenaten left traces that refused to be fully erased. The ruins of Amarna, preserved under the desert sand until excavations began in the 19th century. The Amarna letters, a remarkable archive of diplomatic correspondence found at the site, revealing in detail the international politics of the 14th century BCE. The hymn to the Aten, surviving in the tombs of officials. The ongoing debate about what exactly Akhenaten was trying to do and why. He is the most modern-feeling figure in ancient Egyptian history. Not because his ideas were modern, they weren't exactly, but because his willingness to tear up the received tradition and start over, to say that everything everyone believes is wrong and I alone have the truth, feels very familiar. Tutankhamun became king at the age of approximately 8 or 9. He ruled for about 10 years. He died at approximately 18 or 19 years of age. In historical terms, he was a minor pharaoh. His reign was a period of transition and restoration after the Amarna disruption. He didn't lead great military campaigns. He didn't build monumental temples. He didn't reign long enough to leave a significant administrative legacy, and yet he is the most famous pharaoh who ever lived. The reason is his tomb. In 1922, British archaeologist Howard Carter, working in the Valley of the Kings under the sponsorship of Lord Carnarvon, found a stone step cut into the valley floor. That step led to a descending passage. The passage led to a sealed door. Carter made a small hole in the door and held a candle up to it. Lord Carnarvon, standing behind him, asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter replied, "Yes, wonderful things." What Carter saw was the treasury, one of 4 rooms in the smallest royal tomb in the Valley of the Kings, packed floor to ceiling with the most extraordinary collection of ancient objects ever found: gilded furniture, alabaster vessels, chariots, weapons, ritual objects, jewelry, and, in the innermost chamber, the nested coffins of the king himself, the innermost of which was solid gold, and on the face of the mummy, the golden funerary mask that has become the single most recognizable image of ancient Egypt. The mask is extraordinary. A portrait, idealized but clearly a portrait, of a young man with the striped Nemes headdress, the false beard, the protective cobra and vulture on the forehead. The eyes are inlaid with obsidian and quartz. The eyebrows and eyelids are lapis lazuli. It weighs about 24 pounds and is made of 2 layers of high carat gold. It took Carter and his team 10 years to fully clear and catalogue the tomb. 10 years, with thousands of objects requiring photography, measurement, conservation, and recording. It was the most meticulous archaeological excavation in history up to that point, and the records Carter kept are still the standard reference for the tomb's contents. Tutankhamun's tomb was not entirely untouched. There was evidence that it had been entered twice in antiquity, probably by tomb robbers who were disturbed or caught, before they could take much. But it was close enough to intact that the treasures inside were overwhelming. Now, the curse. Lord Carnarvon died on April 5th, 1923, less than 5 months after the opening of the tomb. He died in Cairo from an infected mosquito bite that had become septic. He had cut it while shaving, and it became infected. He was 57 years old. The press went wild. The curse of Tutankhamun was born. The story spread that an inscription at the tomb's entrance read, "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." This inscription does not exist. It was invented. Carter himself was dismissive of the curse idea for his entire life, and he lived until 1939. 16 years after the tomb's opening. A statistical analysis of all the people present at the tomb's opening and their subsequent deaths found no evidence of unusual mortality. The people who entered the tomb died at roughly the rate you'd expect for people of their age and health status, but the curse story persists. It always will. More serious is the question of how Tutankhamun died. For decades, the most popular theory was murder. Suspicion fell on Ai, the elderly official who became pharaoh after Tutankhamun's death, and on General Horemheb, who succeeded Ai. Both had political motives, both benefited from the young king's early death. Analysis of Tutankhamun's mummy over the decades has produced contradictory results. An X-ray in 1968 detected bone fragments in the skull, which was interpreted as evidence of a blow to the head. Later, analysis suggested the fragments may have been the result of the mummification process or post-mortem handling. CT scanning in 2005 revealed a fracture to the left leg, a fracture that appeared to have occurred shortly before death. This led to a theory that Tutankhamun died from a combination of a leg fracture, possibly from a fall, perhaps from a chariot, and complications from malaria, for which evidence of the malaria parasite was found in his tissue. DNA analysis also revealed that he suffered from multiple diseases simultaneously and had bone abnormalities consistent with inbreeding. Tutankhamun's parents were almost certainly siblings, probably Akhenaten and one of his own sisters. The genetic consequences of this level of inbreeding may have made him chronically ill, with a weakened immune system and physical vulnerabilities that made any injury or disease potentially fatal. The murder theory has largely fallen out of favor among Egyptologists. The current consensus is that Tutankhamun probably died from a combination of genetic disease, illness, and possibly injury. A young man with a compromised constitution who didn't survive an encounter with one or more of the many dangers available in ancient Egypt. The mystery is not fully resolved. It probably never will be. What is resolved, beyond any doubt, is that the contents of his tomb are extraordinary, and that their survival, the fact that this one small royal tomb in the smallest corner of the Valley of the Kings happened to escape significant robbery while every other major royal tomb was stripped, is one of the great accidents of archaeological history. If Tutankhamun's tomb had been robbed in antiquity, we would have almost no idea what a New Kingdom royal burial actually looked like. Every description, every reconstruction, every understanding of what the Egyptians put in their royal tombs is based disproportionately on one small tomb belonging to a minor pharaoh. The great tombs of Rameses II, of Seti I, of Thutmose III, each of which was almost certainly richer than Tutankhamun's, were robbed clean in antiquity. We have the tombs, but the treasures are gone. What would Rameses II's burial equipment have looked like? We can only imagine. If Tutankhamun is the most famous pharaoh because of his tomb, Rameses II is the most famous pharaoh because of himself. He was, by any measure, an extraordinary figure. He ruled Egypt for approximately 66 years, from around 1279 to 1213 BCE. He sired somewhere between 48 and 100 sons, and perhaps as many daughters, by multiple wives and concubines. He built more monuments than any other pharaoh. He inscribed his name on more temples and statues than any other pharaoh, including many that he didn't build simply by having his own cartouche chiseled over someone else's. He fought at the Battle of Kadesh, the largest chariot battle in history, against the Hittites, and when the battle ended in a draw, he declared it a magnificent victory, and had accounts of his personal heroism plastered on temple walls across Egypt. He signed the first recorded peace treaty in history with the Hittite king Hattusili III, and the terms were favorable enough that he married a Hittite princess. He lived to be roughly 90 years old, which was extraordinary in the ancient world, and when he died, Egypt grieved. His mummy was found in the Deir el-Bahri Kasha in 1881. One of the pharaohs rescued and reburied by the ancient priests to protect him from robbers. It is one of the best preserved royal mummies we have. The hair, which turned red or orange with age, and the embalming process is still present. The face, strong, with a long nose and a slightly arrogant expression even in death, looks very much like the colossal statues he had made of himself. In 1974, the mummy was flown to Paris for examination and conservation work. The French government, at Egypt's insistence, received the mummy with full military honours because he had been a head of state. The mummy of Rameses II arrived in Paris and was greeted with the honours due a foreign dignitary, 3,000 years after his death. That detail tells you something about the kind of presence Rameses II still has. The monuments he built are staggering. The temple complex at Abu Simbel, cut into a sandstone cliff in Nubia, 4 colossal statues of himself seated on the facade, each 67 feet tall, is one of the most impressive architectural achievements in human history. When the Aswan High Dam was built in the 1960s, the rise in waters of Lake Nasser threatened to submerge it. UNESCO organized an international rescue operation. The entire temple was cut into 283 enormous blocks and moved, block by block, 65 meters uphill and 200 meters back from the water, reassembled with such precision that the astronomical alignments were preserved. The temple is aligned so that twice a year, on October 22nd and February 22nd, dates believed to correspond to Ramesses' birthday and coronation day, the rays of the rising sun penetrate 200 feet into the innermost sanctuary of the temple and illuminate 3 of the 4 statues there. The 4th statue represents Ptah, the god of darkness, who is deliberately left in shadow. This alignment was preserved in the UNESCO relocation. The Battle of Kadesh is worth dwelling on. In the 5th year of his reign, around 1274 BCE, Ramesses led his army northward into what is now Syria to confront the Hittite king Muwatalli II, who had assembled a massive force. The Egyptians fell into a trap, an ambush that scattered one of Ramesses' divisions and left him temporarily surrounded by Hittite chariots. What happened next is known primarily from Egyptian accounts, which are obviously not neutral. But even allowing for propaganda, what the accounts describe is extraordinary. Ramesses, abandoned by most of his army, rallied his personal bodyguard and fought his way out, rallying enough of his troops to fight off the Hittite chariots until reinforcements arrived. Whether this happened exactly as described, or whether it was Egyptian propaganda transforming a near disaster into a heroic personal triumph, the battle ended without a decisive victory for either side. Both armies withdrew. Both sides subsequently claimed victory, but Ramesses had the louder propaganda machine, and the account he distributed, the poem of Pentor, the longest literary text to survive from ancient Egypt, is a detailed first-person narrative of his personal heroism at Kadesh. It was inscribed on temple walls across Egypt. It was copied and recopied by scribes for generations. It became the first piece of what you might call military propaganda literature in history. The peace treaty that followed, the Treaty of Kadesh, signed about 16 years after the battle, is extraordinary in its own right. 2 copies survive, one in Egyptian hieroglyphics and one in Akkadian cuneiform. It covers non-aggression, mutual defense, extradition of refugees, and a return of political exiles. A copy of the treaty, in a modern reproduction, hangs in the United Nations headquarters in New York. The oldest peace treaty in the world is currently on display in New York. Most people who walk past it have no idea what they're looking at. Ramesses II is also the pharaoh most often identified with the unnamed pharaoh of the Exodus in the Hebrew Bible. This identification is popular in films and novels, but remains entirely speculative. There is no Egyptian record of a mass exodus of Hebrew slaves, and the evidence for dating the exodus to the reign of Ramesses II is circumstantial at best. But the identification sticks because Ramesses II is simply the most prominent pharaoh of the right general period, and because his building projects did use forced labor. Whether any of that forced labor was Hebrew is unknown. What is known is that Ramesses II was one of the most formidable rulers the ancient world produced, and that he was very aware of it. The great temple at Abu Simbel has 4 colossal statues of Ramesses II on its facade. None of them are of any god. All 4 are of him. Ancient Egyptian religion is one of the most complex, most fascinating, and most frequently misunderstood systems of belief in human history. Most people have a vague awareness of a few Egyptian gods: Ra, Isis, Osiris, Anubis, maybe Horus, maybe Thoth, maybe Set. They know that Egyptian gods often had animal heads. They know there were a lot of them. But the depth and sophistication of the Egyptian religious system goes far beyond this. Let me try to give you a sense of it. The Egyptian gods were not like the Greek or Roman gods, distant anthropomorphic figures who lived on a mountain and occasionally intervened in human affairs. Egyptian gods were present in everything. The sun was not just lit by a god. The sun was a god, or several gods in sequence depending on what time of day it was. The Nile flood was not controlled by a god. The flood itself was the manifestation of Hapi, the god of the inundation. The fertile black earth of the floodplain was Osiris. The dry red desert was Set. The world was not a stage on which the gods acted. The world was the gods. This meant that Egyptian religion was not primarily concerned with personal ethics or afterlife rewards. It was primarily concerned with maintaining cosmic order, a concept the Egyptians called Maat. Maat was at the center of everything. She was a goddess, depicted as a woman with an ostrich feather in her hair. But she was also a principle, the principle of truth, justice, order, harmony, cosmic balance. The world ran on Maat. The pharaoh's primary duty was to maintain Maat, to keep the cosmic order functioning through ritual, through right conduct, through the maintenance of the temples and the cult of the gods. The opposite of Maat was Isfet, chaos, disorder, falsehood. Isfet was always threatening. Natural disasters, political chaos, foreign invasion. These were manifestations of Isfet, evidence that the cosmic order was slipping. The great myth cycle of ancient Egypt, the story of Osiris, Isis, Set, and Horus, is fundamentally about the struggle between Maat and Isfet. Osiris was the first king of Egypt, the son of the earth god Geb and the sky goddess Nut. He ruled wisely and well, teaching humanity the arts of civilization. His brother Set, jealous and chaotic, murdered him, sealed him in a chest and cast it into the Nile, then later dismembered his body and scattered the parts across Egypt. His wife Isis, herself a goddess of extraordinary power, described as more cunning than 1,000,000 gods, gathered the pieces of Osiris's body, reassembled him, and with her magic temporarily restored him to life long enough to conceive a child. That child was Horus. Osiris, now permanently dead, became the ruler of the underworld, the lord of the dead, the judge of souls. Horus grew up and fought a series of battles with Set, eventually claiming his father's throne as the rightful king of the living. This myth provided the ideological foundation for pharaonic kingship. Every living pharaoh was Horus, the son of the divine king, the legitimate ruler. Every dead pharaoh was Osiris, resurrected in the underworld, immortal, powerful. The myth also provided the template for Egyptian funerary practice. Just as Osiris was reassembled and preserved by Isis, so the mummification process sought to preserve the body of the deceased. Just as Osiris was supplied with everything he needed for eternal life, so the tomb was filled with food, clothing, tools, and magical texts. The Book of the Dead, which we'll discuss in more detail soon, was essentially a guide for navigating the dangers of the underworld and reaching the paradise of the Field of Reeds, the Egyptian heaven. The gods themselves were not static figures. They combined and recombined in complex ways. Amun-Ra was both Amun, the hidden god of Thebes, and Ra, the sun god, merged into a single entity of enormous power. Ta-Sokar Osiris combined 3 gods of death and resurrection. Egyptian theology was comfortable with this kind of complexity in a way that later monotheistic traditions are not. There were also local gods. Every town, every village had its own protective deity. The cat goddess Bastet was worshipped primarily at Bubastis in the delta. Khnum, the ram-headed god who shaped human beings on his potter's wheel, had his main cult at Elephantine on the southern border. Sobek, the crocodile god, was particularly venerated at Kom Ombo, where the Nile crocodiles were numerous and dangerous. These local gods were not necessarily in competition with the state gods. They coexisted. You could honor Amun-Ra as the supreme deity and still leave an offering for the local protective goddess of your village. Egyptian religion was not jealous in the way that later monotheistic religions were. Animal worship is one of the aspects of Egyptian religion that ancient Greeks and Romans found particularly puzzling. The Egyptians did not exactly worship animals, they venerated animals as manifestations of divine qualities, or as sacred to particular gods. Cats were sacred to Bastet and associated with the protective power of the sun god. Ibises were sacred to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. Crocodiles were sacred to Sobek. At some sites, specific individual animals were kept as the earthly representatives of gods. The Apis bull at Memphis, believed to be the living embodiment of Ptah, was kept in a special enclosure, fed ritual food, and honored at festivals. When the Apis bull died, it was mummified with all the ceremony of a royal burial and interred in the Serapeum, a vast underground catacomb at Saqqara, and a new Apis bull, identified by specific markings, was found and installed. The Serapeum was discovered in 1851 by French archaeologist Auguste Mariette, who found his way to it by following a clue in an ancient text. The underground corridors stretch for hundreds of meters. The massive black granite sarcophagi of the Apis bulls, each weighing around 65 tons, are still in place, because nobody has ever figured out how to remove them. Each one is empty. The mummies of the bulls themselves and whatever funerary goods were placed with them were stolen by ancient robbers who had no difficulty getting in and out. The 65-ton sarcophagi remain. Let's talk about what actually happened when an ancient Egyptian died and their body was prepared for burial. The word mummification comes from the Arabic mumia, meaning bitumen or pitch, a reference to the dark, resinous appearance of preserved bodies. The ancient Egyptians themselves called the process by various names related to preservation and transformation. The goal of mummification was not just to preserve the body as a biological specimen. It was to transform the body into something capable of hosting the deceased's spiritual components, the ka and the ba, so that the person could continue to exist in the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that a person consisted of several spiritual elements that had to be maintained for the afterlife to function. The ka was the life force, the vital energy that distinguished a living person from a dead body. It was created at birth and remained attached to the physical body. The Ba was something closer to personality or soul. It could leave the body during sleep and after death, but needed to return to the body to be fed and sustained. If the body was destroyed, the Ba had nowhere to return to, and the person ceased to exist. This is why preservation was so crucial. The Ba needed the body to come home to. The mummification process, in its most elaborate form, the kind reserved for royalty and the wealthy, took 70 days. 70 was a sacred number, corresponding to the 70 days that the star Sirius disappeared below the horizon each year before its heliacal rising, which marked the beginning of the Egyptian New Year. The process was overseen by specialists. The embalmers worked in a structure called the wabit, the pure place, which was set up near the tomb or in a dedicated facility. The head embalmer wore a jackal mask, representing Anubis, the god of embalming. The first step was removal of the brain. This was done by inserting a hooked metal tool through the nostril, breaking through the thin bone at the back of the nasal cavity and using the hook to break up the brain tissue, which is then scooped or drained out. The brain was discarded. The Egyptians did not consider it an important organ. The heart was kept in the body, because the heart was the seat of intelligence and emotion and was needed for the final judgment in the underworld. The other internal organs, the lungs, liver, stomach and intestines, were removed through an incision in the left side of the abdomen. They were carefully cleaned, treated with natron, and stored in canopic jars, 4 jars, each stoppered with the head of one of the 4 sons of Horus. The human-headed Imseti protected the liver, the baboon-headed Hapi protected the lungs, the jackal-headed Duamutef protected the stomach, the falcon-headed Kebesenuef protected the intestines. The body cavity was washed with wine, the alcohol had some antibacterial properties, and then packed and covered with natron, a naturally occurring salt compound found in dry lake beds in Egypt. Natron drew the moisture out of the body, desiccating it and preventing the bacterial activity that causes decay. The body was left in natron for 40 days. After 40 days, the body was dark, leathery, and significantly reduced in size. The natron was removed. The body was rinsed, and the cavity was repacked with linen, with sawdust, with various aromatic materials. The incision was sewn or covered with a plate. Amulets were placed on the body and wrapped into the bandages. The bandaging itself was an elaborate process that took about 15 days. The fingers and toes were wrapped individually first, then the limbs, then the torso. Specific amulets were placed at specific points in the bandaging, each with a specific protective function. Priests recited spells as the wrapping proceeded, because each turn of linen was accompanied by a ritual act. On royal mummies and wealthy individuals, the face was covered with a mask, in gold for the most exalted, in gilded cartonnage, a papier-mâché-like material for the wealthy, in painted linen or wood for the less affluent. The mask served several purposes. It identified the person, it gave the BA a face to return to, and it protected the most important part of the body. Not everyone could afford the 70-day full process. The ancient Greek historian Diodorus Siculus describes 3 grades of mummification based on cost. The most expensive involved the complete process, as described above. A middle-grade option preserved the body without organ removal by injecting cedar oil through the anus to dissolve the internal organs, which were then drained out. The cheapest option involved simply washing the body and packing it in natron. Archaeological evidence confirms that mummification was practiced very widely, not just on royalty and the wealthy, but on a broad segment of the population. Excavations of ancient cemeteries have found millions of mummies, millions. Egypt's dry climate and the widespread practice of mummification have preserved more ancient human remains than anywhere else on Earth. Modern analysis of mummies has revealed extraordinary things. We know what diseases ancient Egyptians suffered from: tuberculosis, malaria, schistosomiasis, arterial disease. We know what they ate. From the analysis of stomach contents and intestinal remains, we know their genetic profiles. We know the stresses their bodies experienced. healed fractures, signs of repetitive strain injuries, dental wear from the grit that got into grain when it was ground on stone. One of the most remarkable recent discoveries came from DNA analysis of 90 Egyptian mummies from a site called Abu Sir el-Melek, dating from 1388 BCE to the 4th century CE. The analysis showed that these ancient Egyptians were genetically most similar to ancient Near Eastern population from the Levant and Anatolia rather than to sub-Saharan African populations. Modern Egyptians are genetically more African than these ancient mummies, suggesting a shift in population composition over the past 2,000 years. This finding has been controversial. It touches on the politically charged question of the racial identity of ancient Egyptians, which has been debated with an intensity that says more about modern politics than about ancient history. What the science says is ancient Egyptians were complex, mixed, connected to their Near Eastern neighbours, shaped by millennia of interaction with populations from multiple directions. They were neither purely African nor purely Near Eastern. They were Egyptian. The Book of the Dead is not actually called the Book of the Dead. The ancient Egyptians called it the Pert Emhru, which translates roughly as the spells for coming forth by day or the Book of Coming Out into the Light. The name Book of the Dead was given to it by 19th century European Egyptologists who found the rather dramatic title more appealing. It is not a single book. It is a collection of spells at around 200 of them, though no single copy contains all of them, that the deceased could use in the afterlife. Spells to identify yourself to the gods you'd encounter, spells to transform yourself into various forms, spells to repel dangers, spells to ensure you had food, water, and clothing, spells to open doors, spells to not die a second time. The most important spell, chapter 125, which Egyptologists consider the heart of the collection, is the one used for the weighing of the heart. The weighing of the heart ceremony was the central judgment scene of the Egyptian underworld. After death, the deceased was brought before Osiris and the 42 judges of the underworld. Their heart, the seat of conscience and intelligence, and was placed on one pan of a giant scale. On the other pan was the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of cosmic truth and order. If the heart was lighter than the feather, the deceased had lived a good life and was admitted to the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise, a lush and verdant mirror image of the Nile Valley, where the blessed dead could farm, feast, and spend eternity in comfort. If the heart was heavier than the feather, if it was weighed down by wrongdoing, it was thrown to a creature called Ammut, who waited beside the scales. Ammut was a composite monster, the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, the hindquarters of a hippopotamus, combining the three most dangerous animals in Egypt. She ate the condemned heart, and the person who had owned it simply ceased to exist. No underworld, no paradise, nothing. Complete obliteration. The ancient Egyptians called this the second death, and it was far more feared than the first. Before the scales, the deceased had to recite the negative confession, a list of 42 sins that they had not committed. I have not stolen. I have not lied. I have not committed adultery. I have not murdered. I have not oppressed the poor. I have not cheated in the grain measure. 42 denials of 42 specific wrongs. This is sometimes cited as evidence of sophisticated moral thinking in ancient Egypt, a developed sense of ethical requirements that had to be met before divine reward was available. And that's not wrong. But there's a complication. The spells in the Book of the Dead could be used to cheat. There were spells specifically designed to prevent the heart from speaking against the deceased during the judgment, to ensure it testified favorably regardless of what the deceased had actually done. Spell 30B was inscribed on a heart scarab, a stone amulet placed over the heart of the mummy, and instructed the heart not to betray its owner to the judges. This is, to modern sensibilities, a remarkable contradiction. The elaborate system of divine judgment, with its cosmic scales and terrifying consequences, existed alongside a magical tradition of how to circumvent that judgment. You could behave badly in life and use magical spells to fool the god of death. The ancient Egyptians don't seem to have found this contradictory. The magical and the ethical coexisted comfortably in their worldview. Both were tools available to the person trying to achieve a good afterlife. The Book of the Dead also contains the Amduat, the book of what is in the underworld, and the Book of Gates and the Book of Caverns, which describe in extraordinary detail the 12 hours of the night that the sun god Ra travels through the underworld, experiencing various dangers and helping the blessed dead, before emerging at dawn to begin the day again. These texts are found primarily in royal tombs. The painted walls of the Valley of the Kings are essentially editions of these books, the entire cosmology of the underworld rendered in brilliant colour on the walls of the tomb chambers. Spending time in a New Kingdom royal tomb is like being inside a book. The Book of the Dead was originally composed, in its earliest form, in the Middle Kingdom, around 2000 BCE. It was developed and expanded over the following 1,000 years. The latest copies date to the Ptolemaic period, around 100 BCE, meaning this collection of funerary spells was in continuous use for nearly 2,000 years. A copy of the Book of the Dead was one of the most valuable possessions an ancient Egyptian could own. They were commissioned from scribes and illustrators, sometimes personalized with the owner's name inserted into the text, sometimes illustrated with elaborate vignettes showing the key scenes of the underworld journey. Some of the most beautiful objects in museum collections around the world are books of the dead, carefully painted papyri, sometimes 30 or 40 feet long when unrolled, depicting the deceased and their journey through a richly imagined afterlife. The afterlife these texts describe is not gloomy or frightening. Not for those who pass the judgment. It is abundant, green, full of food and company and the simple pleasures of life along the Nile. It is the Nile Valley in its best season, made eternal. That is what the Egyptians were working toward. Eternity by the river. On the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, modern Luxor, is a dry limestone valley enclosed by golden cliffs. The ancient Egyptians called it Ta Seket Ma'at, the Great Field. We call it the Valley of the Kings. For roughly 500 years, from the early 18th dynasty around 1550 BCE to the late 20th dynasty around 1070 BCE, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom were buried here. Not in pyramids. The pyramids' inability to protect royal burials from robbery had been definitively demonstrated by the wholesale looting of the Old Kingdom pyramids. Instead, The New Kingdom pharaohs cut their tombs into the rock of the valley, concealing the entrances, hoping that secrecy would succeed where massive architectural statements had failed. It didn't work especially well. Most of the tombs were robbed in antiquity, but the valley remains one of the richest archaeological sites in the world. 63 tombs have been discovered in the valley so far, numbered KV1 through KV63. KV stands for King's Valley. Not all of these tombs belong to pharaohs. Some were built for royal family members, for powerful officials, for favoured members of the court. The tombs range from simple single-room pits to the extraordinary multi-corridor, multi-chamber complexes of the later pharaohs. KV5, the tomb built for the sons of Ramesses II, has been excavated to reveal more than 130 chambers so far. The largest tomb in the valley, though its contents were stripped in antiquity. KV17, the tomb of Seti I, has painted walls of such quality and detail that they are considered masterpieces of ancient Egyptian art. The valley is not exhausted. This is crucial to understand. Despite more than 200 years of archaeological work, from the early 19th century European explorers to Howard Carter's systematic excavations to the ongoing work of international teams today, the valley has not given up all its secrets. KV63 was discovered in 2005 by an American team led by Otto Schaaden. It contained not a burial but an embalming cache, 7 coffins, one of which contained a mummy, the others apparently used for storage, and over a dozen large storage jars containing natron, linen, and other embalming materials. This was almost certainly the cache of materials used for Tutankhamun's burial, the detritus of his mummification stored nearby. In 2015 and 2016, ground-penetrating radar surveys of the valley, conducted by Japanese scientist Hirokatsu Watanabe, appeared to detect hidden chambers adjacent to the tomb of Tutankhamun. Egyptologist Nicholas Reeves proposed that these chambers might contain the burial of Nefertiti, possibly hiding behind a false wall in Tutankhamun's tomb. This theory generated enormous excitement in the press. Subsequent radar surveys by different teams using different equipment produced contradictory results. The current consensus is cautious. There may or may not be chambers behind the wall, and the question has not been definitively resolved. The Egyptian authorities have been reluctant to conduct invasive investigation based on inconclusive, non-invasive data. The question remains open. Beyond the Valley of the Kings is the Valley of the Queens, where royal wives and children were buried. KV, which contained the tomb of Nefertari, Ramesses II's favourite wife, was discovered in 1904 and contains what many consider the most beautiful painted tomb in Egypt. The colours are extraordinarily well preserved, the painting technique is of the highest quality, and the scenes, the queen in her white linen gown, moving through the underworld, have a grace and humanity that is moving even now. There is also the question of what has not been found. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the one of Shakespeare and history, was buried somewhere after her death in 30 BCE. Her burial place is unknown. An Egyptian Dominican team has been excavating a site at Taposiris Magna, about 30 miles west of Alexandria, which they believe may be the location. They have found evidence of a significant ancient temple complex and have recovered coins and statues linked to Cleopatra. They have not found the tomb. Alexander the Great was buried in Alexandria. His tomb was a major tourist attraction in the ancient world. Julius Caesar visited it, Augustus visited it, and then, sometime in the chaos of the late Roman period, it disappeared from the historical record. Nobody knows where it is. Alexandria has been continuously inhabited for 2,300 years, and the ancient city lies mostly under the modern one. Excavations are extremely difficult. The Valley of the Kings, the Valley of the Queens, the tombs of the nobles on the Theban hillsides, the cemeteries of the workers, the royal tombs of Memphis and Saqqara. Egypt's underground is still full of secrets. Every year, new discoveries are made, not just small finds, but major ones. In 2020, more than 80 wooden coffins were found at Saqqara. Beautifully painted New Kingdom coffins sealed for 3,000 years, still containing their mummies. In 2021, a major haul of bronze statues was found at the same site. In 2022, the extraordinary find of a nearly intact ancient city, Aten, built by Amenhotep III, the father of Akhenaten, was announced after it emerged from under the sand near Luxor. The earth is still giving up Egypt. Around 1200 BCE, something catastrophic happened to the civilizations of the eastern Mediterranean. It happened fast. In the space of roughly 50 years, a dozen major civilizations collapsed or were severely disrupted. The Mycenaean Greeks, the civilization of the Bronze Age Aegean that we know from Homer, with their palace states at Mycenae, Tiryns and Pylos, collapsed completely. The Hittite Empire, which had been the equal of Egypt for centuries, disappeared. The city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast, one of the most cosmopolitan trading cities in the ancient world, was destroyed and never rebuilt. Cyprus was disrupted, Troy was destroyed. Egypt survived, barely, and in diminished form. The cause of this collapse is one of the great unsolved problems of ancient history. It is called the Bronze Age collapse, and it is, if anything, more relevant today than it was when historians first started studying it, because the collapse of a complex, interconnected, globalized system by multiple, simultaneous stressors is something we now have our own reasons to think about. The Egyptians themselves, in records from the reign of Ramesses III, describe being attacked by a coalition of peoples from the sea, groups with names like the Peliset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. Egyptologists have called these groups the Sea Peoples, though they didn't use that name themselves, and the term covers what were apparently several distinct groups with different origins. Who were the Sea Peoples? This is one of the most debated questions in ancient Near Eastern history. The identifications that have been proposed are fascinating. The Peliset are widely believed to be the Philistines, the people who settle in Canaan after the Bronze Age collapse, and become a major power in the biblical narrative. The Danaan may be connected to the Greek Danaans, Homer's name for the Greeks at Troy. The Shekelesh may be related to the Sicels, one of the indigenous peoples of Sicily. If these identifications are right, the Sea Peoples were not a coherent group with a single origin, but a coalition of displaced populations, people whose own lands had been disrupted or destroyed by whatever was causing the collapse, who were now moving through the eastern Mediterranean looking for somewhere to settle, and who in some cases were doing so violently. The causes of the Bronze Age collapse are also debated. Climate change, specifically a prolonged drought that hit the region around 1200 BCE, has been identified from multiple lines of evidence including sediment cores, pollen records, and geochemical analysis. The drought would have disrupted agriculture across a broad region, causing famines and political instability. Political instability would have disrupted the complex trade networks that Bronze Age civilization depended on. Disrupted trade would have caused economic collapse. Economic collapse would have generated social unrest and migration. And into that destabilized system came the Sea Peoples, themselves probably victims of the same climate disruption, and the combination of drought, economic collapse, political breakdown, and external attack was more than the Bronze Age civilizations could withstand. Egypt survived because it had the Nile. The Nile flood was not dependent on rainfall in Egypt itself. It came from rainfall in Ethiopia, a different weather system. Egypt's agricultural base remained functional when the rain-dependent agricultural systems of Greece and Anatolia were failing. Egypt also had a strong military under Ramesses III, who recorded his battles against the Sea Peoples in dramatic reliefs on the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu, the most detailed military records from the Bronze Age. But Egypt was not unaffected. The empire in the Levant was lost. The trade networks that had brought in cedar wood from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, and luxury goods from across the Mediterranean were disrupted or destroyed. Egypt turned inward, poorer and less cosmopolitan, and the New Kingdom began its long decline. The Bronze Age collapse is a cautionary tale. A complex, interconnected, apparently stable system proved fragile when multiple stresses hit simultaneously. The civilizations of the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean had developed over centuries of relative stability and increasing complexity. They had extensive trade networks, sophisticated diplomacy, and significant military capability. And they fell within a few decades. Some of them never came back. The Hittites are gone. The Mycenaean Greeks are gone. The culture that produced them disappeared so completely that when Greek civilization re-emerged centuries later, in the Iron Age, the Greeks themselves had forgotten the Mycenaeans existed. Homer preserves garbled memories of the Bronze Age in the Iliad and Odyssey, but the people who wrote those poems did not know they were describing a lost civilization. The Sea Peoples who settled in Canaan, the Philistines, created their own civilization, interacted with the emerging Israelite culture, fought and traded and intermarried, and eventually disappeared into the broader population of the Levant. What caused the collapse? Climate change, political fragmentation, disrupted trade, mass migration, internal rebellion. Probably all of these interacting with each other in ways that made the whole system vulnerable to failure. The same factors. Egypt did not fall in a day, it didn't fall in a generation. The end of ancient Egypt as an independent civilization was a long, complicated process that unfolded over more than 1,000 years. After the Bronze Age collapse, Egypt survived but was diminished. The New Kingdom limped on for another century after Ramesses III, with a succession of pharaohs, many of them also named Ramesses, because the name had become synonymous with power, who were progressively less effective. The treasury was depleted, the military was weaker, the tomb robberies in the Valley of the Kings accelerated. The priests of Amun at Thebes accumulated so much power that by the end of the 20th dynasty, They were effectively running the south of Egypt independently. Egypt split. The north was ruled by pharaohs from the delta. The south was controlled by the high priests of Amun. This third intermediate period lasted for about 400 years and saw Egypt repeatedly ruled by foreigners, Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians. The Nubian pharaohs, with the 25th dynasty, are one of the more remarkable chapters in this period. Nubia had been under Egyptian control for much of the New Kingdom. The Nubians had absorbed Egyptian culture, religion, and art, building their own pyramids, smaller and steeper than the Egyptian ones, and worshipping the Egyptian gods. When Egypt collapsed into chaos, it was the Nubians who came north and reunified it, ruling as pharaohs in the fullest Egyptian tradition. For about 60 years, from roughly 744 to 656 BCE, the mightiest empire on earth, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, was pressing down from the north, and it was Nubian pharaohs who led the defense of Egypt. They failed. The Assyrians sacked Thebes in 663 BCE, an event so shocking that it echoed through the ancient world for generations. The prophet Nahum, writing about the destruction of Nineveh, compared it to the destruction of Thebes. Are you better than Thebes that sat by the Nile with water around her? Even to people who had no particular love of Egypt, the sacking of Thebes represented the destruction of something that had seemed eternal. After the Assyrians withdrew, a new Egyptian dynasty, the 26th, the Site dynasty, reunified Egypt under native rule. There was a remarkable cultural renaissance. The Site period produced art that deliberately looked back to the Old Kingdom, copying ancient styles as a statement of Egyptian identity. The country was run with new efficiency. Mercenaries, Greek mercenaries, were employed in the army. The Persians conquered Egypt in 525 BCE. Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE. The Ptolemaic dynasty, Greek rulers who adopted Egyptian religion and titles, lasted until 30 BCE, when the last Ptolemaic ruler Cleopatra VII killed herself rather than be taken to Rome as a prisoner of Octavian, and Egypt became a Roman province. Throughout all of this, something interesting happened, or rather, didn't happen. Egyptian culture proved extraordinarily resilient. Foreign rulers again and again adopted Egyptian religion and iconography. The Nubians built pyramids and wrote in hieroglyphics. The Persians presented themselves as pharaohs on Egyptian temple walls. Alexander's generals, the Ptolemies, built temples in the traditional Egyptian style, decorated with hieroglyphic inscriptions, and depicted themselves as pharaohs making offerings to the gods. Cleopatra VII, often imagined as the most Greek of the Ptolemies, was actually remarkable for how Egyptian she was. She was, apparently, the first ruler of her dynasty to learn the Egyptian language. She served as a priestess in Egyptian religious ceremonies. She adopted Egyptian religious symbolism, particularly the imagery of Isis, in her self-presentation. The Roman emperors who ruled Egypt continued the tradition. Their names appear in cartouches on Egyptian temple walls, depicted in the traditional pharaonic style, making offerings to the Egyptian gods. The very last hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 CE at the Temple of Isis on the island of Philae, in the far south of Egypt. It was carved by a priest named Nesmeterekhem, and it was a dedication to Osiris. 3 months after that inscription was carved, a temple at Philae was converted to a Christian church. The ancient Egyptian religious tradition, which had survived for 4,000 years, ended not with a bang, but with a carving on a wall and a conversion of a temple. The knowledge of how to read hieroglyphics was lost within a generation. By the time European scholars in the medieval period encountered hieroglyphic inscriptions, they couldn't read them at all. They theorized that the symbols were purely symbolic, esoteric pictograms carrying hidden philosophical meaning, rather than a sophisticated writing system encoding a spoken language. It took the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, found in 1799 by French soldiers during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, and 2 decades of brilliant scholarly work by Thomas Young and Jean-François Champollion to finally crack the code. In 1822, Champollion announced that he had deciphered hieroglyphics. He reportedly ran through the streets of Paris to his brother's house, collapsed on the floor, and said, "Je tiens l'affaire," "I've got it," before passing out for 5 days from exhaustion. The voice of ancient Egypt had been silent for 14 centuries. And then it spoke again. Egypt is not done surprising us. This is important to say because there's a tendency to think of ancient Egypt as a solved problem, something that was figured out in the 19th century and now just needs to be maintained in museums. This is spectacularly wrong. Egypt is one of the most active areas of archaeological research in the world, and the discoveries being made today are as significant as anything found in the previous 2 centuries. In 2020, a team excavating at Saqqara, the ancient necropolis near Memphis, found a cache of more than 80 sealed wooden coffins from the New Kingdom period. The coffins were brightly painted, the seals were intact, and when they were opened, the mummies inside were remarkably preserved. Along with the coffins, the team found bronze statuettes, shabtis, and a beautifully decorated Book of the Dead papyrus that, when unrolled, turned out to be several meters long. This was not a minor find. These were important burials from around 3,000 years ago, sitting undiscovered under the sand. In 2021, at the same site, the team found hundreds of bronze statues, including a statue of Nefertum, a rare representation, along with more papyri and a cache of 2,500-year-old mummies. The work at Saqqara has been one of the most productive ongoing excavations in the world, and it keeps yielding finds. The lost Golden City of Aten, already mentioned in the Valley of the Kings section, was announced in 2021 after several years of excavation. Found near Luxor, buried under the sand south of Deir el-Medina, the city was built by Amenhotep III around 1390 BCE and is the largest ancient city ever found in Egypt. Streets, houses, bread ovens, tools, jewellery, pottery, all sealed under meters of sand, all remarkably preserved. Some of the rooms still had their contents in place untouched since the city was abandoned. The archaeologist who led the discovery, Zahi Hawass, called it the Egyptian Pompeii. The comparison is apt. The preservation is extraordinary, and the insights it will provide into daily life in 14th century BCE Egypt are enormous. DNA analysis has transformed our understanding of ancient Egyptian genetics and migrations. The 2017 study of Abusir el-Melek mummies was just the beginning. Ongoing research is building a more complete picture of who the ancient Egyptians were. where their ancestors came from, and how the population of the Nile Valley changed over thousands of years. Satellite archaeology, the use of satellite imagery to identify archaeological sites from space, has been transformative. A team at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, led by Egyptologist Sarah Parcak, has used multispectral satellite imagery to identify more than 3,000 previously unknown settlements, 1,000 tombs, and 17 potential pyramids across Egypt. 17 potential pyramids, sitting under the desert, not yet excavated. Ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR technology are being used to map what lies beneath archaeological sites without excavation. The technology is improving rapidly. Structures that would have required decades of excavation to identify can now be mapped from the surface in days. Remote sensing technology has identified what appears to be a buried branch of the Nile, a channel that once ran past the Giza Plateau and would have provided a water route for transporting pyramid-building materials. This would solve one of the long-standing logistical puzzles of pyramid construction. How were the massive stone blocks transported from the quarries to the construction site? If there was a branch of the Nile running nearby, the answer is simple. Boats. Bioarchaeology, the study of ancient human remains, is revealing extraordinary details about ancient Egyptian life. Analysis of the remains of pyramid builders from their cemetery near Giza has shown that these workers suffered from significant physical trauma, back injuries, joint damage, broken bones, but also that they received care. Many of the bones show evidence of healing that could only have happened with skilled medical intervention. The ancient Egyptians were not just working their labor force to death, they were treating injuries and returning workers to duty. Ancient DNA from preserved specimens is answering questions that archaeologists couldn't have dreamed of addressing a generation ago. What did the ancient Egyptians call particular plants? What diseases were circulating in different periods? How did the population mix and change over the centuries of foreign conquest and immigration? The study of ancient Egyptian texts is also far from complete. Thousands of papyri in museum collections around the world have never been fully translated. The Herculaneum papyri, a library of scrolls carbonized by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, many of which are too fragile to unroll, are currently being read using multispectral imaging and AI. Similar techniques are being applied to damaged Egyptian papyri. Every year, new text is being read for the first time in 2,000 years. Egypt is not a solved problem. It is an ongoing conversation between the present and the past, conducted through bones and painted walls and papyrus scrolls and ground-penetrating radar and DNA sequences. And the past keeps talking. All right, let's get into the stuff that nobody can explain, because after 3,000 years of fascination and 200 years of intensive archaeological investigation, ancient Egypt still has more unresolved mysteries than almost any other civilization. Mystery 1. How exactly were the pyramids built? We've discussed this. We know the general principles: ramps, sledges, organized labor. But the specific details, the exact ramp system used for the Great Pyramid, the specific surveying methods that achieved such extraordinary precision, the logistical details of managing a workforce of tens of thousands over decades remain genuinely uncertain. The discovery of the Diary of Mera, a papyrus found at the port of Wadi el-Jarf in 2013, the oldest papyrus ever found, has provided extraordinary new information. Mera was an official who supervised the transport of limestone blocks from the Tura quarry to Giza by boat. His diary records daily activities, the loading of stones, the journey to Giza, the unloading. It is a first-hand account of pyramid construction logistics from the reign of Khufu. But it answers logistics questions. It doesn't fully answer construction questions. How were the stones lifted? How was the precision achieved? The Diary of Mera doesn't tell us that. Mystery 2. The true age and origin of the Sphinx. Is the Sphinx older than Egyptologists believe? Robert Schoch's rainfall erosion hypothesis has not been definitively refuted. It has been argued against, vigorously and with some success, but the question of how to explain the erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls remains technically open. If the Sphinx is older than Khafra, older than the standard Egyptological dating of around 2500 BCE, then either Egyptian civilization is older than we think, or the Sphinx was built by a civilization we don't know about. Neither option is comfortable for the standard framework. Most Egyptologists are firmly in the Khafra built the Sphinx. The erosion is not from rainfall camp, but the debate is not entirely over. Mystery 3. What's under the Sphinx? The seismic surveys of the 1990s detected anomalies that have never been fully investigated. Are there chambers under the Sphinx? The Egyptian authorities have consistently declined to allow the kind of invasive investigation that would definitively answer this question. The official reason is concern about damaging the monument. Some people suspect other reasons. The question remains open. Mystery 4. What happened to Nefertiti? The most beautiful face in ancient Egyptian art, the wife of the heretic pharaoh, possibly the most powerful woman in Egypt during her lifetime, and we don't know where her mummy is. We may have identified it, we haven't confirmed it. Mystery 5. The purpose of the pyramid texts passages. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious texts in the world inscribed in the pyramids of the late Old Kingdom, have been translated. Their general function, spells to help the deceased pharaoh navigate the afterlife, is understood. But many of their specific references, the names of places and beings and rituals they describe, remain obscure. We don't fully understand the cosmology they're operating in. Mystery 6. What caused the Old Kingdom collapse? Climate change, political overextension, the power of regional governors undermining central authority, all of these. The collapse at the end of the Old Kingdom, after 6 dynasties and more than 500 years of the most concentrated building program in human history, was one of the most dramatic in ancient history. We don't fully understand it. Mystery 7. The identity of the Exodus pharaoh. Was there an Exodus? If so, who was the pharaoh of the Exodus? The Hebrew Bible doesn't name him. The candidates that have been proposed, Ramesses II, Thutmose II, Ahmose I, Amenhotep II, each have various arguments for and against. There is no Egyptian record of a mass exodus of Hebrew slaves, which is either because it didn't happen, or because the Egyptians didn't record their defeats, or because the records haven't survived. The question of whether the Exodus happened at all, as a historical event as opposed to a theological story, is itself deeply contested. The archaeological evidence for a large Israelite presence in Egypt followed by a mass departure is thin. But the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the story is too central to too many traditions to dismiss lightly. Mystery 8. Who built the labyrinth? Ancient writers, Herodotus, Strabo, Pliny the Elder, described a massive structure near the pyramid of Amenemhat III in the Fayum as the most extraordinary building they had ever seen. They called it the labyrinth. They described thousands of rooms, underground passages, courtyards, temples. Herodotus said it surpassed the pyramids. Pliny agreed. The site has been identified. It's at Hawara. But what excavation has found is minimal. Fragments, foundations, debris. The building itself seems to have been comprehensively quarried for stone in antiquity. Ground-penetrating radar surveys in 2008 detected what appeared to be regular structures beneath the surface at the site, possibly the remains of the labyrinth, buried under meters of rubble and soil. A follow-up excavation was approved and then apparently blocked by the Egyptian authorities. The labyrinth, described by ancient writers, was possibly one of the most remarkable buildings ever constructed. If it exists under the sand at Hawara, it has not been excavated. If it was destroyed, we have lost something almost incomprehensible. Mystery 9. The astronomical precision of Egyptian monuments, the Great Pyramid's orientation to true north, the alignment of Abu Simbel's inner sanctuary to the sun twice a year, the alignment of the temple at Karnak to the midsummer sunrise. These precision alignments keep appearing, and we don't fully understand how they were achieved with the instruments available. Some of the proposed explanations are ingenious, some are speculative, none is fully proven. Mystery 10. What we haven't found yet. This might be the biggest mystery of all, given that Egypt keeps producing major discoveries: the lost city near Luxor, the Saqqara coffin caches, the possible hidden chambers near Tutankhamun's tomb. What else is still out there? How many tombs are still unexcavated? How many papyri are still unread? How many cities are still under the sand? The answer is a lot. Egypt is not done with us. Ancient Egypt has been fascinating people for a very long time, not just in the modern period, not just since Napoleon's Egyptian campaign launched Egyptomania in the 19th century, or since the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb launched it again in the 1920s. Egypt has fascinated outsiders since antiquity. The Greeks were obsessed with Egypt. They travelled there as tourists and scholars. Herodotus spent months there collecting his histories. Plato reportedly studied with Egyptian priests. The Greek philosopher Thales, credited as the first philosopher in the Western tradition, may have learned mathematics from Egyptian sources. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest library in the ancient world, was built in Egypt, drawing on both the Greek and Egyptian intellectual traditions. The Romans were equally fascinated. Egyptian obelisks were shipped to Rome by the dozen. There are more ancient Egyptian obelisks in Rome today than there are in Egypt. Egyptian religious cults, particularly the cult of Isis, spread across the Roman Empire. Isis, the great mother goddess, the magical healer, the devoted wife and mother, became one of the most widely worshipped deities in the Roman world, with temples from Britain to the borders of India. Medieval Europe imagined Egypt as a land of hermetic wisdom, a repository of secret, philosophical and magical knowledge. The tradition of Hermeticism, which claimed to transmit the ancient wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus, a mythological figure who combined the Greek Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth, influenced everything from Renaissance philosophy to modern occultism. Why does Egypt keep exercising this fascination? Part of it is scale. The monuments are simply so big, so old, so well preserved that they cannot be ignored. A pyramid is not a subtle thing. It sits in the desert and insists that you think about it. The people who built it, the civilization that produced it, the ambitions it represents, these are not questions you can dismiss. Part of it is the writing. Hieroglyphics are visually extraordinary, complex, beautiful, apparently meaningful in a way that other ancient scripts are not. Even people who can't read them understand that they're saying something. The combination of images and sounds, the animals and human figures and geometric shapes arranged in columns and rows, communicates a sense of depth and meaning before you've understood a word. Part of it is the death. The Egyptians were so focused on death and the afterlife that their culture has an intensity around mortality that speaks to something very deep in human experience. The mummies are disturbing and fascinating in equal measure. These are people, real people, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, preserved in ways that make them more present than the dead of almost any other civilization. They have faces. In some cases, they have names and histories. They are individual people who had lives and died and were prepared for eternity. Part of it is the mystery. Egypt generates mysteries faster than it solves them. Every discovery reveals something new that nobody expected, and that raises new questions. The endless incompleteness of our knowledge, the fact that major new things are still being found, keeps the fascination alive. If Egypt were fully understood, if everything were known, it would be less compelling. But it isn't fully understood. It isn't all known. And part of it, I think, is what Egypt represents as a cultural achievement. 3,000 years of continuous civilization. 3,000 years of building, writing, creating art, developing religious ideas, governing complex societies, maintaining cultural identity in the face of invasion and disruption and change. No civilization in human history has matched that continuity. The Roman Empire lasted about 500 years in the West. The Chinese imperial tradition lasted about 2,000 years. Egypt lasted 3,000 years as a recognizable, continuous cultural entity. That longevity is almost incomprehensible. The distance between the first pharaoh and Cleopatra is greater than the distance between Cleopatra and us. Ancient Egyptians living in Cleopatra's time looked back at their own ancient history the way we look back at ancient Rome. Egypt was ancient to the ancients, and it still speaks to us. The Egyptians believed that as long as your name was spoken, you were not truly dead. The BA could return, the car could be fed, the person could continue to exist. Death was not the end as long as memory persisted. By that definition, the pharaohs are not dead. Rameses II is not dead. Hatshepsut is not dead. Akhenaten is not dead. Tutankhamun is not dead. Their names are spoken by millions of people in hundreds of languages every single day. They live in the museums where their objects are displayed, and in the libraries where their texts are studied, and in the classrooms where their history is taught, and in conversations like this one, wherever you are in the dark, listening. That was the whole point. That was what the pyramids were for. Eternity. Alright guys, that is ancient Egypt. 3,000 years of history condensed for your bedtime listening pleasure. We went from the floods of the Nile and the first farmers along its banks through the earliest pharaohs and the unification of the country, through the pyramid builders and the Sphinx and all the mysteries that go with them. We visited Hatshepsut's temple and Akhenaten's radical experiment, and the golden mask of Tutankhamun, and the colossal statues of Rameses II. We read the Book of the Dead, and walked through the Valley of the Kings, and followed the mummies into the embalming room. We talked about the Bronze Age collapse and the slow fall of Egypt, and the moment Champollion cracked the code of hieroglyphics and the voice of the ancient world came back. And we looked at all the things that are still unknown, still under the sand, still sealed in coffins, still waiting to be read on papyri that no one has unrolled yet. If you're still awake, congratulations, and also, are you okay? The lights should be low now, the fan should be going, you should be somewhere that feels safe and quiet, which is a gift. And if you have it right now, it's worth noticing before you drift off. Egypt was obsessed with the idea that this life is a preparation for something else, that the things you do here, how you treat people, what you build, what you leave behind, matter in ways that extend past your own death. Whether that's literally true or not, I find it a useful way to think. What are you building? What name are you writing on things that might last? The Egyptians had a word for it, Ka, your vital essence, your life force, the thing that persists. May yours persist for a good long while. If you haven't subscribed to Eyes of Earth, please do. It costs you nothing and it means a lot. Share this one if it found you at the right moment. I'll be back with another one soon. Until then, good night, sleep well, and wherever your dreams take you tonight, may they be somewhere worth building.